herd immunity for HPV is around 80%. And so this is around the time that's important that we get to the children before they start having intercourse.
And back to the HPV, we met some families today who say after their kids got the HPV vaccine, their life totally changed. They weren't able to talk anymore. Their livelihood was gone. What do you have to say to that?
This is not statistical evidence. This is anecdotal evidence, and we need to be making sure that we're using statistical evidence and not anecdotal evidence.
Your take on the HPV vaccine, do you think it should be mandated in the schools? Why?
The reason is that the truth is that there's no evidence HPV vaccination has prevented a single cervical cancer anywhere in the world.
You sure about that? What's going on, guys? Iggy checking in, Shadowman TV checking in. I want you guys to check this out real quick, man. Quick video. Couldn't go live tonight, man. I'm very tired. I'll see you guys tomorrow, though. But definitely, what you're about to see, some real shit, man. Some deep stuff here, man. And I don't know, man. It might hit close to home to you, man. It hits close to home to me. My cousin just had a newborn, and I'm really trying to talk to her about these shots that the government are handing out. And I finally got her to listen, but you know, just pray for me, guys, and pray I can get through to my cousin that she doesn't go letting them put all kind of shots and needles in her newborn son. All right, please, I'm begging you guys for your prayers on this. Yeah, like seriously, please pray for it, please. But I want you to watch this, guys, and at the end, and once you see, like, wow, that was some deep stuff, hit that like button for me, drop a comment, let me know what you think, and pass this information on. Share this to everybody you know and everybody you love. And I don't care if you have a prime, public, #1 enemy. As long as they didn't beat a woman up in your family or beat kids or they're not a pedophile. As long as they're none of them. Even your enemy, pass this information on to them. Because no kids, and no human, no adult, period, deserves this. Love you guys. Hope you liked the video. Let me know what you think at the end.
Coronavirus. Researchers from the University of Texas at Austin and the National Institutes of Health created the first 3D scale map to support a vaccine that could combat the coronavirus. The map shows the part of the virus that attaches to and infects human cells. Researchers say this is an essential part of the research that can help develop a vaccine and antiviral drugs to help fight the virus.
Almost all of them in mainland China, where 74,185 cases of infection have been confirmed since it first emerged in late December. The team from the University of Texas at Austin and the National Institutes of Health (NIH) first studied the genetic code of the virus made publicly available by Chinese researchers and used it to develop a stabilized sample of a key part called the spike protein. They then imaged the spike protein using cutting-edge technology known as cryogenic electron microscopy, publishing their findings in the journal Science. The spike is really the antigen that we want to introduce into humans to prime their immune response to make antibodies against this, so that when they then see the actual virus, their immune systems are ready and loaded to attack, UT Austin scientist Jason McClellan, who led the research, told AFP. He added that he and his colleagues had already spent many years studying other members of the coronavirus family including SARS and MERS, which helped them develop the engineering methods required to keep the spike protein stable. Their engineered spike protein is itself being tested as a potential vaccine by the NIH. The team is sending the map of its molecular structure out to collaborators around the world so they can improve it by making it provoke a greater immune response. The model can also help scientists develop new proteins to bind to different parts of the spike and prevent it from functioning, to treat those already infected. These are known as antivirals. This is a beautifully clear structure of one of the most important coronavirus proteins, a real breakthrough in terms of understanding how this coronavirus finds and enters cells, said virologist Benjamin Newman at the Texas A&M University Texarkana, who was not involved in the work. The structure shows that although the spike is made of the three identical proteins, one flexes out above the rest, effectively giving the virus a longer reach, he added. A useful aspect of the structure for vaccine development is that it maps out the size and location of chains of sugar molecules the virus uses in part to avoid being detected by the human immune system, added Newman. Cryogenic electron microscopy uses beams of electrons to examine the atomic structures of biomolecules that are frozen to help preserve them. 3 scientists credited with developing the technology were awarded the 2017 Nobel Prize in Chemistry.
A month. So, there's a lot that we have to learn about this virus. It certainly seems to be spreading faster than we saw with SARS and with MERS. We aren't really clear about where this virus came from, and we're not really clear about how it spread. I mean, as a scientist, that's probably the most concerning element about this current outbreak. So our technology, DNA medicine, does something differently. Instead of using a protein or the whole virus, we use just a small piece of the genetic sequence of the virus. We received the viral sequences from the Chinese government. We downloaded the sequences, and within 3 hours, we had a vaccine designed. And the genetic sequence of a virus basically is the blueprint of everything that makes up that virus. So we use a computer algorithm to scan that sequence to try and find tiny motifs in the DNA sequence and the genetic material of the virus that we think that the body would be able to mount a really strong immune response against. So we identify those motifs, we insert it into another piece of DNA called a plasmid, which is really just a carrier piece of DNA. We make lots and lots of copies of that DNA inside bacteria, which happen to be really excellent tiny little factories for making DNA. Then we purify that DNA medicine, and then we add it to the human body, to completely healthy, normal cells. And that piece of DNA acts like a map or a picture for the human body to say, oh, I really need to recognize this part of the virus. And it's able to then go and find the virus, attack it, and hopefully kill it. So there's nothing on the market yet for DNA medicines, but we are the furthest along with this technology because our lead product's in phase 3 testing. So that's the final stage before it goes for full approval and marketing. And we're hoping to have it ready for human clinical trials in early summer. What I've heard a lot of in the media is, oh, it's not as dangerous as flu. And I can really understand why people feel that way. But I would kind of preface that by saying, firstly, I think we should take all virus outbreaks really seriously and treat them all differently because they all are very distinct. And I would argue that flu is, of course, very serious and many people die of it every year. But we have a vaccine for flu and we have treatments for flu. And also our clinicians know what to do when somebody comes into a hospital or a doctor's office with flu. For the novel coronavirus, we have none of those things. And so I do think that it maybe minimizes the potential impact of the virus by comparing those two things.
Say they've made a critical breakthrough in developing a vaccine for COVID-19, the Wuhan coronavirus. Researchers were able to create the first 3D atomic scale map of the part of the virus that attaches to and infects human cells. It's called the spike protein, and mapping this part is an essential step so that researchers around the world can develop vaccines and antiviral drugs to fight it. We talked with one of the researchers at UT today. He said they're already working on a vaccine as a result of their findings. He wouldn't say when that vaccine might be available to the public.
Predictions are hard, especially about the future. I wouldn't really want to give unfounded hopes or expectations. What I would say is that just as evidenced by the fact that this came out so fast, that things are moving faster than we can imagine, and they're available to more people and more scientists worldwide. And so what I would say is check back in 2 months.
Their research paper was officially published earlier today in the Journal of Science.
My name is Dr. Lawrence Pilevsky. I'm a pediatrician, originally trained at NYU School of Medicine, graduated in 1987. Finished my residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York in 1990 and did a fellowship at the Bellevue Hospital in the outpatient department. The first 9 years of my career were spent in ERs, running an intensive care unit, working in a neonatal intensive care unit, working inpatient in the hospital, working in a clinic, and then eventually having a private practice. In 1983, when I started medical school, I was taught vaccines were safe and they were effective and give them. But I was not taught about any of the science around their safety or any of the studies around how safety were done. And it wasn't until 1998 that a mother came up to me and said, "Dr. Larry, did you know that there's mercury in vaccines?" And I said, "No, I did not." And as a medical student, I was trained to critically think. If you see an observation, you go after it, try and figure out if there's a question to ask. So instead of just ignoring it, I looked further into the vaccine ingredients. And I found that there were a number of vaccine ingredients that in animal studies were proven to be very dangerous to animals. And I didn't understand why these same ingredients were actually in vaccines. I was starting to hear stories from parents, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of stories from parents who took a very healthy child into their doctor's office and then found that their child lost much of their health, whether it was their speech, whether it was seizures, whether it was death, whether it was asthma, allergies, eczema, whether it was autism, whether it was learning disabilities, whether it was inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune diseases. And every one of those parents were told it had nothing to do with the vaccine. Every single one. And this continues today. But yet, when I look at the ingredients that are in the vaccines, I have the science to actually explain how these medical problems could be happening in these children. Today, one child in 5 is learning disabled. In 1976, it was 1 in 17. 1 in 6 under age 8, 1 in 2 adolescents, and 1 in 4 young adults is diagnosed with a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. 1 in 20 children under the age of 5 have seizures. 1 child in 40 develops autism. The number of cases of children and adults with autoimmune diseases is rising exponentially. It's one of the highest rising diseases in this country. And the vaccine ingredients, if you are willing to look at them and understand how they work when they're injected into the body, can be seen to be responsible for every single one of these cases. So what are these ingredients? Well, when I was in medical school, we were taught that the body has something called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is like Fort Knox to the brain. Elements of the bloodstream cannot get into the brain. And those elements include drugs, viruses, and bacteria, among other things that are in the blood. Drug companies were very concerned about being able to develop drugs to get the drugs into the brain. And so they used something called a nanoparticle. Nanoparticle, very small particle, bound to the drug. And they found that if they could put a nanoparticle onto a drug, they could get that drug to go into the brain. And it shows in animal studies that they were able to do this. They then were able to take an emulsifier, which is something that's good with water and fat. It can dissolve in both. And if they added the emulsifier to the nanoparticle bound to the drug, they could increase drug entry into the brain 20-fold. This is right out of animal studies that I've found. So you have a drug, you have a nanoparticle, and you have this emulsifier. The vaccines are constructed the same way. You have the vaccine viruses and bacteria that are bound to a nanoparticle called aluminum. And that aluminum is a nanoparticle. And by definition, a nanoparticle has the potential to enter the brain. Most vaccines also contain polysorbate 80 or sorbitol. Both of those compounds are emulsifiers. Emulsifiers bind very tightly to the nanoparticle aluminum, which is bound very tightly to the vaccine antigens. This raises a question. If the vaccine model is the same model as the model that the drug companies are using to enhance the delivery of drugs into the brain, Is it possible that vaccine ingredients are making their way into the brain of our children that could explain why so many parents are watching their kids deteriorate after vaccinations, even though the doctors, the media, and the government say absolutely no connection, even though the science suggests that there is? You cannot find a single study in the literature that addresses whether the injection of aluminum into the body penetrates the brain, whether any vaccine ingredients enter the brain, and whether polysorbate 80 enhances the delivery of any of those ingredients into the brain. And when I could not find those studies, I was concerned, because I'm told, you're told, vaccines are evaluated and very, very distinctly tested for safety. But yet, you cannot find a study that says, does aluminum get into the brain of children? Does aluminum take other vaccine ingredients into the brain that don't belong in the brain? Because when ingredients get across the blood-brain barrier that don't belong in the brain, they cause inflammation. And inflammation is what we see in 1 in 5 children with learning disabilities and 1 in 40 children with autism. And all you have to do is ask the guidance counselors. And if you get honest pediatricians who are telling you what they're seeing in their practice, they're seeing kids one after another with more and more brain disorders. Now, as a medical doctor who was taught to think, I then went into the literature and said, are proper science studies done, safety studies, where you take a vaccine and you inject it into 100 kids, and then you give 100 kids a saline placebo, meaning it's inert. No study exists to actually evaluate the safety of a vaccine compared to a placebo group. None. When vaccines are studied, the maximum amount of days that vaccines are studied are up to 10 days to 2 weeks. And unfortunately, the vaccine manufacturers pre-select what side effects they will allow to be associated with the vaccines. So if a child has a vaccine reaction that is associated with the vaccine manufacturers will decide whether or not it should or should not be associated with the vaccine. And the public knows this, and they're learning it more and more. So if your child develops seizures 5 months after a vaccine, your child is told by the doctor it had nothing to do with the vaccine. But that's not true, because there are no studies to prove it. There's opinion, but there's never been a study really addressing whether a vaccination at 2 months or even 9 hours of age could be related to an event that happened months or even years later. And yet we have some of the sickest children in our country. In New York, we lost the religious exemption on June 13th because the unvaccinated children with a religious exemption were blamed for a measles outbreak. When I met with representatives in New York, I told them that there is no study to prove that unvaccinated children have ever been proven to start an epidemic. And he was surprised. And he said, I will vote against removing the religious exemption if I can't find a study, like you say. He could not find a study, but he voted to repeal the exemption anyway. Because there are no studies. There are no studies proving that unvaccinated children are responsible. There's consensus. And here's why there's consensus. We are taught that vaccines stop the children from carrying the germs that we are vaccinating against. And study after study shows that children who are vaccinated can still carry the germ despite having received the vaccine. So, the vaccinated are still capable of spreading disease, but the unvaccinated are being unfairly blamed because of a consensus opinion, but not true science. To repeat, no study, no science has ever proven that vaccines eliminate the existence of the organism in your body. If anything, science is showing that the vaccines cause the organisms to mutate. And there are plenty of articles showing that strains are replaced by new strains after vaccination, similarly to the way antibiotics are bringing about new strains of bacteria because of the overuse of antibiotics. So why are we blaming the unvaccinated children? No study has ever been done in this country appropriately to address the health outcomes of children who are vaccinated versus the children who are unvaccinated. I have been seeing families in my practice for over 20 years that have opted out of vaccination. They are the healthiest children I have ever seen. I have families who have older children who have been vaccinated, middle children who have been partially vaccinated, and then younger children who have not been vaccinated at all. And those families are rising in number, and they see the difference between the health outcomes of their younger children who are rarely sick versus their older children who are getting IEPs in schools, needing medications, ERs, and constant health issues. And all I get when I hear that, when I state something like that, is, well, that's anecdotal. Well, it's anecdotal if you see it a couple of times, but it's not anecdotal when you see it for over 20 years. And when you speak to parents, and when you speak to teachers, and when you speak to guidance counselors, and when I speak to pediatricians who are too afraid to come out in public. There is pressure to ostracize the families who know the science and know the lack of science that's available. There's a lot of consensus. And when I think about the subject of vaccination, I want to ensure that if we're going to prevent infectious diseases in children, that we don't create something worse in its place. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of beliefs instead of actual science, and beliefs go a long way. I took the oath of first do no harm, but when I look into the science and I don't see long-term studies, and I see only short-term studies up to 4 to 10 days where the side effects are manipulated by the manufacturers who are the only ones doing the studies on the vaccines. And when I see no placebo groups, and I see no studies of the single ingredients or the combined ingredients, and I see the science, the biochemistry of the ingredients in animal studies, where animals who are given the aluminum are found to have motor delays and behavioral problems, which is a great deal of what we're seeing in children today. I say, are we first doing no harm? And so first do no harm means the precautionary principle. And more parents are understanding the dangers of vaccines, and that's why we're seeing such pressure to mandate vaccines, because more of the science is coming out. In order to create herd immunity, you have to be able to prove that children who are vaccinated are immune. And the sad part about that is that whenever you vaccinate a population of children, you're always going to have a population that doesn't develop any antibodies at all. The estimates of that are about 10%, that vaccines will fail in 10% of the population. Vaccination, no antibody production. But the next group is even more suspicious, because when you vaccinate and you do produce an antibody, there is science to show that the presence of an antibody doesn't guarantee immunity either. And we don't know the percentage of children who get a vaccine, develop an antibody, but aren't immune at all. We assume that if we vaccinate, we're getting protection. We assume that if we vaccinate, we're stopping spread of disease. those are assumptions that have never been solidified in science, and I'm happy to offer more explanations during the Q&A. I wouldn't say that if I didn't have the science to prove it. The parents that I work with in New York, that I see around the country, are very concerned that their rights are being taken away, that their knowledge about the science is being pushed away by an agenda that only says unvaccinated children are a problem. Just to wrap up, in New York, when we had the measles outbreak, in California, when they had a measles outbreak, there were 194 cases. Of the 194 cases, 73 cases were due to the actual virus in the vaccine itself. 73, 38%. 73 cases were due to the measles virus causing measles. All the literature states that measles virus infection is not true measles and should not be counted as a health threat. That means only 121 kids developed measles, 121 people. New York State did not do the proper testing that's given down by the CDC to test every child to see if the children had measles strain, wild type measles, or a mutated measles. There are cases around the country and around the world where in a 95 to 98% vaccinated population, they had measles outbreaks because they found mutated viruses. There, as I said before, there are cases where the virus mutates, where there are strain replacements. New York State did not do the proper testing of the 1,000 plus young children and adults who came down with measles. They wrote a little blurb on the CDC website of the 2 wild viruses that were responsible for the measles outbreak. But we in New York know that the testing was not done. 4,200 kids on Long Island had the religious exemption and were not vaccinated. And there was not one case of measles on Long Island. Thank you.